And I just want to apologize. There was a slight change to my title. I've been workshopping this paper over the summer to kind of get it ready for publication. So I've been playing with some different titles, but essentially the main themes are the same. And on that note, I would greatly appreciate any comments or feedback you might have, especially in preparing this sort of paper for publication. All right. So to begin, historians always like to start with a quote. So perhaps the most fitting one to this paper comes from the British physician, Dr. Robert Druitt, who stated, quote, "Civilized man must drink, will drink, and ought to drink, but it should be wine." And it is precisely this expectation and sort of discourse which characterizes our discussion today. So for most of the 19th century, the colonial wine industries in Australia and South Africa did not provide significant economic revenue for the British Empire. In comparison to wool, wheat, and eventually gold and diamonds, wine was a risky venture, often with little to no return on investment for years. But at the beginning of the 19th century, the political circumstances on the European continent, namely the wars with France, may have motivated the establishment, or in the case of the Cape Colony, the continuation of a wine industry. But the prevailing cultural conceptions of wine largely dominated the imperial mindset behind viticulture. So simply put, wine production was an economic gamble, and the British settlers arriving at the Cape and South Australia in the 19th century did not bring with them skills in wine growing. So if that economic profitability was so fragile, then what accounted for the persistent promotion they received? And is my argument for today's paper that the cultivation, production, and consumption of wine was endowed with a higher purpose and promoted, quote, cultural improvement alongside colonization. Now, while these two motivations may not have been mutually exclusive, in the case of wine growing in the British colonies, the British Empire sought to transplant a culture of, quote, civilization while also acquiring new territory. Now, this paper considers the cultural discourse of wine as a civilizing tool. So historically, wine was recollected as the symbol of Greco-Roman civility, reified as the lifeblood of Christ, romanticized as the superiority of Western and Southern European regions, and reimagined as a promoter of Victorian sensibility. Beyond social and moral improvement, wine was also seen as a method to improve physical health, particularly in regards to colonized persons of color, and designated as a beverage of temperance in comparison to harsh spirits. Now, in the violent spaces of wine farms and colonial canteens, this intersected with racial conceptions of colonized persons needing to be, quote, improved through wine consumption. Promoters of Western European civility and gentlemanly conduct felt these sentiments of progress were universally accepted, so it was only right for them to be shared and imposed on the colonies. The expansion of print media and networks within and outside the British Empire ultimately facilitated the exchange in cultural discourse about wine. The circulation of these ideas often translated into colonial policy. Such networks, however, isolated actors as frequently as they connected them. The conception of wine as socially and culturally superior meant that by design, it could never be equally accessible to the masses. So separating wine as this beverage of distinction effectively produced more markers of difference. As this paper will demonstrate, the liberal humanitarian ethos of the British Empire purported to, quote, uplift the colonized populations through wine, had greater interest in controlling behavior and consumption practices of persons of colors, and that superseded those intentions. So the first thing, an unnamed writer in 1826 claimed that the climate of Australia contained a, quote, Ionian elegance. He also suggested that because this climate was similar to that in Greece, so too would a similar civilization and elegance occur. This discourse permeated early conceptions of wine production. In the spirit of the revival of the classics in the 18th and 19th centuries, wine too was revered as an inherited beverage from the ancient Greeks and Romans. There was also speculation that the grapes which were rarely, if ever, used for wine production in Britain, actually were brought to the land by the Romans themselves. Thus, not only was the consumption of wine in Britain a well-practiced method to embody the spirit of these ancient civilizations, the production of wine in Britain's colonies would similarly allow Britain to assume its role as the rightful heir to the Roman Empire. Now, others suggested that much like Bacchus and other ancients who traversed the world and introduced viticulture and civilization, British colonization could do the same. The inclusion of the classics or the ancients in wine writing became commonplace in Britain and is evidenced here on the screen from one of the most famous wine writing works, Cyrus Redding's A History of Modern and Ancient Wines. And you can see even from the illustrations alone, this connection of the ancient to the modern and how there is that kind of Roman or Grecian antiquity. And this suggested an increased desire to kind of tie current wine producing regions of the world as heirs to the cultural civilization of wine producing empires of the past. Now, similar to the description of ancient wines and practices, so too was there a reverence for wine in its religiosity. Now, there are over 100 direct references to wine in the Bible alone. The French Huguenot refugees who arrived at the Cape Colony in the late 17th century were said to have, quote, brought with them the Bible in one hand and the vine stock in the other. This significant role in Christianity then meant that the spreading of the religion across the world, whether by missionaries or other imperial institutions, often brought with it actual vineyards and wine production. In comparison to spirits, wine was socially acceptable, much like in 1830 when missionaries in the Western Cape tried to build a vineyard to supply their laborers with wine. Now, many of the associations of wine with religion, specifically with Christianity, had to do with the consumption of wine. In an address to the Young Men's Society of Richmond on February 1861, pictured here on the left, Charles Ellis delivered this impassioned plea to remember wine as a, quote, divine provision given by God. In opposition to both the teetotalers of temperance and the advocates of free consumption, Ellis carved out a space where the production and consumption of pure wine was a deliberately Christian act. Years later, the Adelaide Observer, an extract pictured here on the right, also espoused the divinity of wine to be consumed in its purest forms without excess. To both Ellis and the anonymous editorialist, it was the discipline of only consuming a respectable amount of wine that made it a Christian act. The publication of these ideas in a local Australian newspaper demonstrated a diffusion of these ideas and discourse to the British colonies and acknowledged the significance of Christianizing both colonization and consumption. Now, the civilizing discourse embedded within the cultivation of the grapevine also had ties to France specifically. Though Alice Conklin uses the civilizing mission to discuss the importation of Frenchness to colonial Algeria, here it's employed to discuss the transplantation of French wine varietals, winemaking methods, and practices of consumption to Australia and South Africa. By making colonial industries and behaviors, quote, more European, the British Empire could impose a sense of civility and sobriety on the colonial population. Even the idea that these two colonies could become modeled after the French or Southern European wine-growing countries was geographically determined. This meant that if the climate and soils of Australia and the Cape were similar enough to the environments in France or Southern Europe, so too could the quality of wine be, and by relation, the societies themselves. So a British physician and wine grower in South Australia, Dr. Alexander Charles Kelly, compiled data on temperatures and rainfall throughout the seasons in the most famous wine districts of Europe and major cities in Australia. And that's pictured here on the left. These charts showed how the mean annual temperatures in Melbourne were close enough to that in Bordeaux, suggesting that grape varietals in Bordeaux could be easily transferred to Victorian soils. Kelly also inverted a map of Australia to match the latitudes in Western Europe and North Africa, demonstrating an insistence that winemakers in Australia could look to France or Southern Europe by Europeanizing colonial soils, rainfall, climate. The growers, producers, and even merchants who arguably did the most to make their wines sellable, sought to improve the international reputation of colonial wines, which for the most of the 19th century was fairly mediocre. Now, among its proponents, the greatest contribution that wine growing could bring to the populations of the British colonies was social and physical improvement. British troops stationed at the Cape, St. Helena, and India were given Cape wines in an effort to curb drunkenness caused by harsh spirits. Thus, the keepers and enforcers of British colonization themselves were being, quote, improved with consumption of Cape wines. The vision for the colony of South Australia in the 1830s was designated to be superior to its predecessors in New South Wales and Tasmania. And it also drew on this civilizing discourse of wine. Here, growing and drinking wine would proffer a liberal capitalist counterpart to the convict culture of its predecessors. The notion of South Australia as a superior colony meant that its economic and agricultural products would also need to emulate that sense of civility. Now, the use of wine in Britain's empire fell within a broader progressive movement for social uplift. It's important to remember that many temperance proponents did not perceive wine as alcohol, and therefore that it could not corrupt like rum or gin or other liquors. In theory, increasing the production and consumption of wines instead of spirits would, quote, civilize the lower working classes. The magazine The Australian Vineyard stated, quote, where wine is the common beverage of a country, sobriety is constantly the rule and intemperance only the exception, sorry. Therefore, the consumption of wine created a sober population alongside its colonization of uncultivated lands. Not only would the increased consumption of light wines uplift, it would also promote social stability and family order. Wine growing often painted this idyllic image of the Victorian family working together to grow, harvest, and produce wine. Here, viticulture would transform convict culture of single men in Australia to a stable, family-based colonial society. Importing wine culture to the British colonies was thus an explicit act of replicating, quote, civilized British identity. At Port Jackson, New South Wales, early colonists offered wine to Aboriginal Australians as a measure of their, quote, civility. In the eyes of colonial agents, Banalong, an Aboriginal Australian given wine by colonists on the first fleet to Port Jackson, and who eventually traveled back to London with these colonists, was consuming civilization and ultimately achieving a status unclaimed by his fellow Indigenous Australians. In reality, when Banalong returned to Australia, he was ostracized by British colonists and his former Aboriginal societies, and he was addicted to alcohol. South Australia held itself to this higher moral ideal, and this included controlling the consumption of alcohol by Aboriginal Australians, especially by white men and women temperance activists. Now, while the consumption of wine upon colonization was a measure of civility, consumption by Aboriginal Australians towards the end of the 19th century was evidence of their, quote, backwardness. Conversations with Baruch Barak, one of the last chiefs and active spokesman of the Wurundjeri, I really apologize for the name, the Aboriginal Australian tribe, the Wurundjeri tribe, or what the English have called the Yara Yara. And he mentioned, quote, if the town of Melbourne gave him no money, it was because they thought he would drink it all. And this was a common conception of consumption practices of non-white populations in the British Empire. Here, the Aboriginal Australian was presented with a fantasy of whiteness that they would be unable to achieve. Thus, the consumption of alcohol in its absence or overuse served to marginalize Indigenous populations within the colonies. At the Cape of Good Hope, tensions remained high between temperance activists and the Cape Dutch vine boers. Wine farmers convinced policymakers that wine was, quote, natural, and they drew on rationales that wine was food and not alcohol. Such conflict illustrated the competing visions of social progress between white women and their wine-growing male counterparts, both of whom determined what was, quote, civilized, for their non-white consumers. Temperance's intersection along racial lines cut Indigenous Africans with a double-edged sword. Was consuming alcohol in the Western Cape a right for all people, or did it keep persons of color under the thumb of colonial oppression? In their own words, Indigenous perspectives on alcohol consumption varied. David Matomela stated that he was adamantly opposed to prohibition and, quote, should have the same rights and privileges as a full-grown white man. Here, saying no to alcohol was a freedom to which all men should have access. Canteens or other bars were often the only form of available leisure and offered spaces away from the farm or mining compound. To many persons of color, wine, brandy, and other spirits were mechanisms of power which subjected them to white oppression. Taifu, who's labeled in the records here as a, quote, fingo, testified, "It does us harm because it is sold to boys and girls and women who come into town and drink it. When these girls begin drinking, they go to the bad and become prostitutes." Not only did many of these indigenous groups subscribe to the notion that sobriety and morality were inextricably linked, but also that independence from alcohol meant liberation from white control. Now, improving the social and moral constitutions of the colonial population was merely one aspect of the civilizing mission. Equally present in the discourse on wine was its role as a promoter of physical health. Many stimulant commodities were thought of as medicines initially and later became associated with food. Wine was widely promoted as medicine and a, quote, gentle stimulus to health in Britain, as depicted in many of the ads you've seen here on your screen. Dr. Robert Druitt, whose quote we started the presentation with, professed his own personal experiences prescribing numerous patients wine or brandy. He felt compelled to not only recommend wine, but also teach patients how to properly consume it. Many wine growers, particularly in Australia, were actually physicians themselves, possessing not only the belief system that wine could heal, but also the financial capital to invest in vineyards, which often took years to return a profit. Dr. Christopher Rawson Penfold, the English physician who emigrated to South Australia, started growing and making wine to treat his patients. Much like W.L. Cleland of Cleland and Sons, who established a vineyard at Parkside Asylum in Adelaide. Now, ads for medical wines and brandies fill the pages of colonial newspapers, magazines, and agricultural journals.
Sorry to interrupt. This is just your 2-minute warning.
Perfect, thank you. There was even an ad for red quinine wine for the blood and nerves. Now, quinine's historical treatment against malaria for sailors and colonists entering the, quote, tropics solidified wine's use as a necessary beverage for physical health. Similarly, Cape Madeira was being shipped to hospitals in India and St. Helena. Wine growers in the Cape Colony also touted, quote, doctor's orders as a mechanism for combating temperance activists and opening new markets for colonial wine. Now, conceptions of race often intersected across conversations on wine and health. Missionary John Campbell, who traveled through South Africa in the early 19th century, encountered what he labeled a, quote, Kaffir family in the Karoo. Now, when he noticed the wife was sick, he gave her some wine, which he eventually also gave to her other family members. His anecdote revealed an insistence that wine was perceived as an acceptable method of treatment, regardless of the ailment this woman may have had. His broader, quote, mission, as evidenced in the preface of his book, was to convert and civilize. Thus, his decision to treat the indigenous Africans he encountered with wine was part of a broader civilizing mission endowed within the discourse of wine's healing powers. Similarly, Reverend Bleasdale, a South Australian wine grower, went to the colony of Victoria to, quote, minister under savages, and, quote, found the Melbourne savages most in need of his spiritual guidance and most appreciative of his knowledge of wines. Now, both Campbell and Bleasdale, as missionary travels, undoubtedly interacted with more indigenous persons in Africa and Australia than the average colonist, but it was their attention to the medicinal properties of wine that altered the nature of these encounters. Among its proponents, natural wines did not harm the native populations. And so to close here, the specific discourse intersecting on wine and health produced different connections to race. Most often, which races could benefit from the consumption of wines. Amidst this cultivation of whiteness, the colonial government and white settlers actively made decisions about who should drink alcohol and what kinds. Removing agency from non-white consumers of alcohol affirmed their categorization as separate and, quote, uncivilized. The discourse was clear. The ruling white population could improve the health and constitution of its non-white population with natural light wines and ultimately strive to, quote, uplift said populations to a civilizational status closer to their own. The language of wine and health codified the colonization of consumption. Thank you.